So for our second lecture this week, we're going to be looking at another theory that is based on language, but is much more concerned with the relationship between language as communication style and the way that's woven into a literary text than some of the previous theories that we've looked at that were also kind of like coming out of linguistics. This isn't so much coming out of linguistics as it is coming out of a kind of theory of communication. So the text I asked you to read is Mikhail Bakhtin's 1934 essay, Discourse in the Novel. And when we talk about dialogics as a mode of criticism, Bakhtin pretty much is the guy. This dialogics doesn't really survive so much as a kind of general mode of theory that people still practice, say like structuralism does, or like deconstruction, or even the various formalisms that we've talked about. Rather, it seems to get like kind of woven into other modes of criticism. There are very few critics who are kind of thoroughgoing practitioners of dialogics, and yet Bakhtin's influence, this isn't the stuff you put on cuts, it's Bakhtin, right, Russian theorist. Bakhtin's influence on subsequent literary criticism is enormous, right? So it's going to be helpful to know a lot of these terms that come out of dialogics because they're hugely important in the work of other later thinkers. All right, so who is this guy, Mikhail Bakhtin? So he's born in 1895, dies in 1975. He's a Russian philosopher and literary scholar. Right? You probably could have gathered that without my having told you. And he remains pretty much completely obscure in his home country and in the West until the 1960s. There are a couple of reasons for this. One, because his work did not accord with Soviet orthodoxy, right? Like much like the work of the Opoyaz scholars that we talked about when we discussed Russian formalism. The state actually actively suppressed much of his work for most of his life. And because of this, he was unable to secure employment in a major Soviet university, so he didn't really have a comfortable academic perch from which to write and teach. He was also not able to leave the USSR for a variety of reasons. So he was kind of stuck, he continued writing, but was kind of stuck toiling in obscurity for a period of about 35 years. So finally, in the 1960s, there's a period of kind of temporary liberalization in the Soviet Union. And Bakhtin's hitherto ignored work is discovered by a generation of younger scholars and starts appearing in translation in Europe as well. And it's translated into English, into French, and various other European languages. And then it's just kind of spread out from there. Now, in terms of, you'll see a huge gap here in terms of the important texts in dialogics, right? The beginning of the movement really is Bakhtin's book, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, published in 1929. You'll see then that Bakhtin does not publish another book for 40 years. When he publishes Rabelais in his World, which is where he really kind of outlines this concept of the carnivalesque. This is one of these important ideas in theory that comes from Bakhtin that we'll talk about in this lecture. He publishes his last book is published posthumously, The Dialogic Imagination. It's really kind of a collection of essays he'd written earlier. It's published in 1981. In terms of his followers, in the Anglo-American world. The British novelist and critic David Lodge has written a book called After Bakhtin, which would be worth checking out. Lodge is also, as I said, Lodge is also a novelist, and he very much takes Bakhtin's ideas of discourse and heteroglossia to heart in his novels, so they're worth checking out. And probably the most thoroughgoing Bakhtinian in the English-speaking world is Don H. Bialystok, who has written a book on Wordsworth's Dialogics and the Practice of Criticism. So if you want to find like Bakhtinian dialogics in its kind of most pure, undiluted form in English, Bialystok is the guy to check out. All right, so what's the philosophical basis for all of this? So Bakhtin's basic argument, right, the basis for everything else that he writes, is the idea that a text is an interplay of multiple voices or discourses, right? You'll remember, this is a little bit similar to structuralism, right? You'll remember that for the structuralists, a text was a kind of play of different social codes and cultural conventions, right, that are activated when a reader examines them. So Bakhtin is saying something similar here, right, that the text is not so much an interplay of different cultural codes, but an interplay of multiple voices, right? Voices being the important. Remember, this is called dialogics, right? So dialogue is centrally important to the idea here. So each voice or discourse is a social as well as a verbal phenomenon. So what do we mean by that? Well, first off, language is used to communicate, right? And the language in which a character or a narrator communicates is indicative of a number of things about that character, right? Social class, education, politics, race, all kinds of identities that are attached to the way someone speaks. Now, a discourse for Bakhtin is the language in which an individual voice speaks. A voice is a texture that's woven from strands like the sorts of things I was just talking about a moment ago, right? Social group, ethnicity, class identity, speech community, right? So for example, if we look at, say, Liverpool English and the dialect that is referred to as Cockney, right? They're both white, working class, British speech identities, right? But they represent different communities in different places, right? The interests of people in Liverpool are different from the interests of people in working in London, right? Even if they're members of the same social class. And so using these different registers of language, these different voices, can indicate different sets of interests and priorities. And all uses of language for Bakhtin owe their meaning to specific social situations and circumstances, the relation of the speaker to an actual or implied listener, right? So who the speech is addressed to is an important determinant of meaning. And relationship to prior utterances. And this is also a little bit similar to structuralism, right? You'll recall that the basic idea of structuralism is that we're trying to figure out the rules that govern a language by looking at the way individual utterances are related to each other, right? Dialogics works in a similar way, or establishes meaning in a similar way. All right, so to look specifically at discourse in the novel, today's essay. So discourse refers to that medley of voices in a text that are irreconcilably opposed to each other in terms of social attitudes, values, and interests, right? So what we have in a text is the unfolding not so much of a coherent plot or narrative, right? Bakhtin really isn't all that interested in what happens in a text. So he's different from the Russian formalists in this sense. Right? So the Russian formalists do care what happens in a text and the order in which it's related, right? Bakhtin doesn't really give a shit about that. What Bakhtin cares about is the play of voices competing or complementary, right? The various discourses that fight with each other for attention in the text. So even if the plot wraps up neatly with a nice little bow on it at the end of a novel or a short story, and Bakhtin's work is much more commonly applied to novels and novellas, basically long-form prose fiction is poetry, although it can be applied to poetry, and I welcome you to make the attempt. So even if the plot wraps up neatly at the end, there's no real resolution because those voices are going to keep struggling against each other, right? So Bakhtin differentiates between what he calls monologic discourse and dialogic discourse in the novel. So monologic novel is one that is dominated by a single voice, usually the author's, right? So however the author presents themselves in the text, right? The author has total control of discourse in a monologic text. The example that he gives is the work of Leo Tolstoy, in which all the voices and discourses in the novel are subordinated to the author's purposes. In a monologic novel, a lot of the characters often kind of sound the same and sound rather like the narrator. And all of those, there's an attempt to kind of keep all of those competing voices, all of those competing discourses under control, right? But there's a purpose here that we're trying to work towards. And we're not just going to let these people speak out of turn, or these voices speak out of turn. Now, the dialogic text, on the other hand, is one in which there either is no single authorial voice, or that voice is kind of unobtrusive and is just one among many competing parts of discourse. So in a dialogic novel, characters are kind of permitted by the author to discourse freely without merging their identity or their consciousness into the author's larger purpose or idea. So we might also call a dialogic novel polyphonic, right? Many voiced. And the example that Bakhtin provides is the work of the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. Most of Bakhtin's examples are, for obvious reasons, other Russians, right? Go figure. Now, related to this idea of discourse, this is a term you will see in the work of other theorists as well, is what Bakhtin calls heteroglossia. Well, Bakhtin doesn't call this term heteroglossia. His translators call this idea heteroglossia. It's a translation of a Russian word, raznorichi, I think that's how you pronounce it, not entirely certain, but it translates directly into English as different speechness. Because that sounds awkward, his English translators usually put it into Greek and say heteroglossia, right? Different voices. And this is how Bakhtin refers to the existence of conflicting discourses within a text. So linguistic variety for Bakhtin is the result of tension between voices that speak the same national or ethnic language, but are in social conflict with each other, right? So I've got kind of three examples here of people who all speak some form or derivative of British English, right? We've got Ozzy Osbourne, who speaks in a working class Birmingham accent in India, right? We've got Bob Marley, who grew up speaking Jamaican English. And we have Queen Elizabeth II, whose usual mode of communication is what is usually referred to as standard English, but is probably what would more accurately be described as prestige English, right? The language of the elite class that dominates media and education and what have you, right? So we've got an elite voice that is in potential competition. If we put all three of these characters into a story, right? There are various regional conflicts that their linguistic differences will express. There are class conflicts, potential racial conflicts that their differences in speech will reflect. Even though they're all speaking the same language, right? They're all speaking English, but the ways in which they speak English are connected to competing identities. So heteroglossy refers to differences between the narrative voice and voices within the novel and differences within the voices themselves, right? So it refers to both of those things. Now, another important idea that filters out from Bakhtin to other theorists is this notion of the chronotope. So this is Bakhtin's term for the spatial and temporal coordinates of a given narrative taken as a whole. This is basically a fancy-ass way of saying setting by combining two Greek words, right? Chronos, time, and topos, place. Although usually when we talk about setting, we're talking about the place and maybe the historical era in which the text, the action of the text occurs, right? What Bakhtin is including in his idea of the chronotope is the physical setting plus time in all of its possible senses, historical era and clock time, as a factor in interpretation. The last important term I want to introduce to you, before I kind of give you an example of how we might do Bakhtinian reading of a text, is the carnivalesque. Look at these goofballs. Don't they look like they're having a good time, right? And carnivalesque, right, is basically about the idea that literature is fun and subversive, right? It's supposed to be fun and subversive. So the carnivalesque is an idea taken from folk traditions and folk humor, and the idea of these kind of peasant ideas, these folk traditions, invading and overturning the authority of the highbrow literary text. So it's inherently subversive. It involves the overturning of normal hierarchies. Think of traditions like, the crowning of the King of Fools, right? Who rules for a day, so maybe during Mardi Gras during the Christmas season. The reversal of traditional binary values, right? Where the thing that we think is good, typically, say, wisdom, is temporarily overturned by stupidity, wealth overturned by poverty, elites overturned by popular things of that nature. And yeah, it's basically like the end result of all this is the dethroning of authoritative voices by the people, right? So think, if we go back to the last slide, right? Think Ozzy Osbourne and Bob Marley teaming up to overturn the authority of the Queen. That would be a hell of a mashup, wouldn't it? Black Sabbath and the Wailers. All right. So to give you an example of how this works in practice, I want to look at one of my personal favorite short stories, James Joyce's 1914 tale, The Dead. So let's actually start here with the chronotope. So it's set in a middle-class house in Dublin, the colonial capital of Ireland, in the immediate aftermath of the Victorian period. So kind of like between the death of Queen Victoria and Irish independence, at a time when there is a nationalist movement of growing intensity rising in Ireland. And there's a great deal of tension between a new rising educated Catholic middle class, particularly in urban centers like Dublin, and the old Protestant elites. This also takes place during the Christmas season, at the 12th night party, right? So that would matter as well in our interpretation. That's part of the chronotope. What did that happen? So in terms of the various voices and discourses, right, our heteroglossia here, we have our perspective character, Gabriel Conroy, who is the authorial substitute, right? And he is an educated man and an educator, right? A man of strong literary sensibilities, and probably the best educated person in the room throughout the party, right? And he's well aware of this. And instead of this giving him some sort of authority, it actually makes him kind of profoundly uncomfortable. It makes it difficult for him to connect with some of the other characters, causes him to lose arguments or refrain from arguments with people like Lily, the caretaker's daughter, who was actually the first voice we hear at the beginning of the story. And it begins in her working class idiom rather than Gabriel's more educated, polished language. Right, and we have Gabriel's aunts and cousin, the Mrs. Morgan, who own the house, right? And these are unmarried women who have made an independent living as musicians. And so their discourse is often concerned with music and also with the church, which was in 1914 Dublin the primary way to make a living as a musician. There's Gabriel's wife, Greta Conroy, who comes from the west of Ireland, from a rather different background and a different place. And this causes some tension between her and her husband, right? That Gabriel doesn't like remembering that Greta comes from the west. So he's always kind of trying to subordinate her voice in certain ways to his, and failing to do so. Gabriel's colleague, Miss Ivers, is also present at the party. So Miss Ivers is a woman of Gabriel's own age who is as educated as he is, and is also an ardent nationalist. So she is in some ways demographically and intellectually similar to Gabriel, but with this added element that challenges him and that challenges his own kind of bland aestheticism. Another character who is a contemporary of Gabriel's, direct contemporary, is Freddie Malins, who is an alcoholic who speaks in a distinctly working class dialect. And representing the interests of the Anglo-Irish Protestant elite is Mr. Brown, who is also, like Gabriel, always trying to take control of conversations and then saying the wrong things, slipping up, failing in some way. And the final voice we have represented here is actually kind of repressed or submerged voice. One of the dead referred to in the title, Michael Fury, a boyfriend of Greta's from when she was a girl back home in Common. And he is a young boy who sang beautifully. She remembers a particular song that he sang, right? So he is represented more through memory than through actual presence of voice. And these competing discourses, right, all resist Gabriel's attempt to impose order on them or to control them. So by the end of the party, he leaves feeling kind of embarrassed and uncomfortable, but also completely misunderstanding and misrepresenting in his own head the attitudes of his own wife. So they get back to their hotel room, and he thinks that they're going to get together and have the best sex of their lives because they're suddenly in simpatico, only to realize that he has completely failed to read the situation properly and failed to bring his wife along with him into his private aesthetic world. So he ends the story kind of forced to acknowledge her world, her concerns, and the worlds and concerns of all of these people he's not really seen as his social equals or peers throughout the course of the story. So that's how you might do a dialogic reading, or one way you might do a dialogic reading of a single text. So for your work on the discussion board, right? Now, it might actually be fairly easy to apply some of this to a play because a play really is written in dialogue, right? It really is an interplay of, it is literally an interplay of competing voices. So see if you can apply some of Batine's terms and ideas to King Lear. Do you find the play to be more monologic or dialogic? Right? Like, does there seem to be a single controlling voice? And can a play with multiple speaking characters even be monologic? Why or why not? And another thing you might want to do, take a text that you're familiar with, that you care deeply about or really appreciate, in which several characters seem to speak in competing voices from a variety of different positions. And how does considering each of these voices in turn and their relationships to each other open up an interpretation of the text? Another thing you might do with King Lear is examine the role of the fool and how it mirrors not Kent's but Edgar's masquerading as Tom of Bedlam, right? How do these fools, these, kind of like truth-telling jester characters, contribute to a sense of the carnivalesque in the play? And finally, another thing you might try to do is identify and describe the chronotope of a text that's familiar to you. And how does considering its spatial and temporal setting affect the way we interpret it? All right, so I will post all of this on Georgia View, so you'll have the PowerPoint to reference. But I look forward to seeing what y'all do with this on the discussion boards. See you next week.